Welcome to the Danville City Commission special call meeting this Thursday morning, April the 11th. The time is 8:35. We have a very short agenda, but we welcome you to this meeting, and we're going to turn it over to staff. It's all about budgetary discussions. So with that said, Mr. Coffey.
Thank you, Mayor Commission. I'm not going to necessarily begin with a lot of commentary. Today's really Lee's reporting, which we appreciate her effort. She's put in a lot of time, and so I value what she's done, and I hope she knows that, and I hope you guys do as well. Some nuances, we know that we were spending down the fund balance. I want to remind us of that. We know that we have, and this is something unique, and Lee and I have talked a little bit about this, is that I think this is a period that you have more active department heads in the city than you had before. And so that's causing us to necessarily have to budget a little differently, because, I mean, they just get more stuff done because there's just so many of them. So, for example, you still have, I still do, work. I cause activities that cause expenses, and back in the day, it was just me. Now you have still me causing activities. You have Josh Morgan causing activities as the city engineer. You have Marshall Carrier, who's not with us this morning because he's working on an activity, right? And so you have so many more. You have Melanie Crossfield taking a leadership role and being proactive in ideas, and she sends stuff my way, and Tommy's here now. So it's going to continue to take a little bit post-COVID to properly depict our activities with our forecasting sometimes. Now, I'll just say that. Important to me is where our expenses are relative to the last fiscal year, especially. So when I'm looking at the spreadsheet, I was telling Lee, one of the things I focus on is going back to the actual 2023 and comparing that to where we're sitting this year. That's important to me. And just so you kind of know, picture that a little bit in your minds, because I do think that's important. All right. So Lee, go ahead.
Okay. So I do want to, before we dive into the PowerPoints and the spreadsheets, I did want to talk about this a little bit. So it is a summary. We haven't done the detail of each account line like we normally do. So this is the first year that we are pulling the data out of our budgeting, the new budgeting software. So it's a little different. Probably the first thing you may or may not have noticed as you are looking down at your spreadsheet is your revenues are negative numbers right now. So that's a function of accounting, essentially, is that they're not negative, but in the software, to balance everything in the proper manner, they populate as negative numbers. This is a visual construct. If you guys get through today or the next couple meetings and it bothers you, just say the word. It'll take me to do a couple little manual clicks, but overall it's a very easy fix. So, but this is how it comes out of the system. So if it visually bothers you, just say the word, and I can correct that, right? Or I can change it, not necessarily correct. So, number one, visually it's different. We've also found that over the years, our true account structure has not been consistent from fund to fund, which makes the new budgeting software, which relies heavily on similarities between account structures, it makes it hard for it to subtotal things. So we're going to be going through a transition where it just does it a little bit easier. So your individual funds, the subtotaling is currently we're doing it manually until we get that account structure changed a little bit. All that does is essentially change the numbers that you guys you aren't focused on the numbers. Staff will have a little bit of a challenge on that, but of learning the new numbers. But we're hoping by the next meeting with the full document, you'll be able to see those subcategories that you're used to.
One of the simpler, on that, for example, if we printed it, like the finance department's line item budget, you all will recall there's subtotals in those budgets. There's like the personnel, and so you all can track the personal expenses over the years. Right now, that line's missing if we print it out. So that subtotal in each one of those groupings of expenses, and so we didn't emphasize printing those account details for this meeting. We just printed the department totals because those subtotals aren't in there. We just felt like that it would be harder to communicate with, honestly, because it's just one big list of account lines in those budgets. So we'll try to work on that and figure out a way to communicate and depict that correctly. So it's a learning curve for us. It's new software for us. It's been interesting, but it's a good quality product, and certainly provides a lot of more control and oversight in the future. And so we're looking forward to the full utilization of that. And I see Chief Gray back there. I'll say this: the police department, fire department. I mentioned Josh and Tommy because they were sitting back here on my right, but it's every department head. It's not just those three, or you know what I mean. Like I want to acknowledge the effort the police and fire did as well, right? I don't want to lose that in terms of being active. Go ahead, Lee.
Okay, so, like I said, anyway, visually, this is just, it's a little bit different than we're used to. It also is backwards. I was gonna point that out from what we're used to. Previous, spreadsheets, we started from earliest to, current, and then it goes the opposite way. So some of it is just formatting, and it might just be that you guys would have never realized it until I mentioned that last year it was backwards compared to this. But few little visual changes that I don't want you guys to kind of get thrown for a loop on if you're taking this home and looking back at it. So we will get started. We're going to cover the end of last fiscal year, current year to date, and where we think we'll be at the end of this year, and just kind of a general overall, just kind of a reminder of what we had discussed previously concerning revenue. So if you guys have any questions as I'm going through all this, let me know. And we will get into the PowerPoint. So general fund, fiscal year 23, budget to actual on revenues. So we ended the year up in revenues, which is always a positive sign. We exceeded budgeted revenues by 5.6 million. The largest category of that is your license and fees. Primarily, that was your occupational license fee, which is your payroll tax. When you drill down the next budget, you'll see the detail. The net profit that ended very positively as well, which is a little bit different than the current year. That one has kind of pulled back down a little bit. Overall, your revenues were very, very strong last fiscal year. Your fiscal year 23 year-end operating expenses, you did end slightly over budget between those different departments. It netted to $217,000 out of 15.9 million budgeted. Some of that was due to some departmental health expenses last year in a couple of the funds. Part of that is a function of, like my fund is slightly over budget, or my department is slightly over budget, things that correlate with your revenue. We have a fee that we pay for our occupational tax collections. If that is higher than that, if that revenue is higher, then that expense is higher. So there are a few things that trend like that. Then we just did see a increase in inflation impacts in everybody's budget for overall. Everyone controlled that within their own department as really well, all things considered. So 217,000 out of 15 million is a very small percentage. So overall, that's pretty good. So your non-operational expenditures. So your non-departmental expenditures, which is this first chart here on, oh, that is not the right button. Your first chart here on the left, your non-departmental expenditures, if you remember, that includes your transfers to your other funds, which does involve operations for other funds, like the cemetery fund or the garbage fund. It also involves your capital expenditures from streetscapes, from Park and Rec that we have planned. The green column is your budget, your blue is your actual, and if you notice the non-departmental, it's the biggest, right? Last year, we budgeted quite a bit in transfers. We didn't get there. If you guys remember, we've talked a couple times about the schedule of certain projects that we had ongoing, and if they have delays, the expense gets delayed, and so those kind of got moved back. So you'll see that reflected in the current year. Debt service was on track, and then your capital. The variance there, rarely do we have a overage in capital in a fiscal year. Partly that was the new fire station. So while we did have a ribbon cutting in August of 2022, those final pay apps that come in for things like that roll in afterwards. So that was just a function of timing as well. Overall, budget to actual, you were budgeted, revenue-wise, you were budgeted at 19.3 in operating revenues. And then actuals were 24.9 million. And your appropriations, which are your expenses, we were budgeted at 37.2 million, and actual were 33.9. So currently, our current budget for the fiscal year for general fund, we are budgeted $20.7 million in revenue. Always your largest category is your license and fees. We did budget a potential capital financing in the general fund for some park and rec capital. We have not yet issued that because we felt we could spend down our fund balance and cash flow that rather than debt finance it so far for the projects that we currently have on the books. So that green out of sync at the last set of columns is your budgeted debt financing that we have not utilized. So your occupational tax, again, is supposed to, projected to be slightly above budget, not nearly what it was last year. Last year it was 5 million. This year it's probably gonna be closer to 1.5 to 2 maybe, because we've seen a slowdown in our net profits compared to last year, and a little bit of a slowdown in just the ratio of new collections on our payroll tax.
Recall on those two big revenue items on the occupational license and net profits. We've aligned our prediction on those for the most part with what we've been told by that the resources provided to KLC. So we've been very conservative with that number, which is why we've consistently estimated a little bit under with what the economy is actually doing. But part of that was post-COVID, and part of that was nobody really knew how the economy would continue to react. You're seeing an investment in salaries across the system, which is driving your occupational license up. And so we're still trying to settle down on a predictable number for those things, right? So being under that projection is intentional to a certain degree. We're getting closer to that number. That number's slowing down, definitely. And so you'll see that budgeting become more and more accurate in this next cycle, probably.
And then, so when you look at the actual spreadsheet, you can see your categories of your taxes. We're projected to end the year at 2.4 in property taxes, which includes your, physical property, vehicle tax, your license and fee, which includes your occupational license, net profits, alcohol, insurance premiums. We're projected to end at 17.5. 7,000 for penalties and forfeitures. That's always a small fluctuating category. Your service revenue at 383,000. That includes, it's possible looking across, so if you look at that line, there was a slide that I did not have time to create that we'll kind of cover in more detail on service revenue. So, and that is specifically our park and recreation contribution that comes from the county. So in previous years, we had budgeted for it in the general fund, which is why you have a budgeted $709,000 for this current fiscal year. And as of today, we're at $534,000. However, we've had feedback from auditors that we should instead do budget for that directly into the Park and Recreation Fund instead of doing a transfer. So we do have a budget amendment coming later in the year to account for some capital stuff. This will be included. So you won't necessarily hit your $709,000 budgeted mark for that category, but it's not because we didn't collect it or receive it. It's because we are transitioning where it is recorded. So that one will be lower than what we've budgeted, but it nets in a way that we'll have a little bit more of a specifics on. Your other recurring revenue, which includes some, okay, there's some math wrong on this. And I blame it on the negatives. That is definitely not quite right. I apologize. I'll get an update for that other recurring revenue as well, because that's not going to end at 279 if we're already at 339. I apologize. I'll get that update to you guys soon before Ashley sends you this packet. We'll move on to expenses.
Can I ask,
Yes.
how much, what, do you know the dollar amount exactly from the county, what they contribute?
Yes. Let me pull that up. This year, it is, Royal Parks. This year is $366,935.
That covers Bunny Davis, Millennium, everything.
That
That's the
covers
total.
their entire contribution, yes, to the park system.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Okay. And just by function of me opening this spreadsheet a little bit more to see the detail, the amounts that were off in our service category is our contribution from the utility fund back to the general fund. Somehow those have gotten copied, the wrong total is copied over. So that's not a collection per se from an outside entity. It's a accounting method to account for, Earl's work in utilities, my work in utilities, any staff not directly in utilities. So I will get the detail out to you guys with those corrected on that. I apologize. So moving forward, expenses in the general fund. We do anticipate that they are slightly above budget. We budgeted 16.7 million expense in the general fund for your operations. We are year-to-date at 3.9, and we're estimated to end the year at 17.5. A couple of them are going to be addressed in that budget amendment as well. The mid-year salary adjustments we did, we haven't done the budget adjustment to account for that. Because anytime your budgeted appropriations goes up, unless you can pull out that full amount elsewhere, you need a budget amendment to account for it. We've also seen increased health costs in some departments that's really hit several people. If you have budgeted $150,000 and you know, somebody has surgery or has a child or anything like that, your health costs just really do break that departmental budget. Now, we account for that in our non-departmental section. We budget that as kind of a, the max liability that we could have on health insurance elsewhere, but we try to track what each department truly will spend on health insurance to better budget for future years. But in cases where it does happen, then your budget is exceeded from what you planned. So-
Yeah, so say it another way. The way Randy does that is each department gets the expected cost allocated to it. And so then your max liability, because each, you know, you do have a maximum for each occurrence. So the max liability, that difference, he adds to non-departmental so that your total appropriation is an attempt to cover the total appropriation is there with the max liability, but it's not necessarily in individual departments.
Yeah.
Right? If that makes sense. And like, so for example, my incident is borne by the line item for health insurance and legislative executive, but that max liability was allocated out of the non-departmental. So the total appropriation for the city should be covered theoretically, if that makes sense.
And as you see, well, the non-departmental expense, it includes that health insurance cost, that overage, or that gap between what we expected and the total max that we budget for. Non-departmental budgeted transfers are included in that section, so that also inflates your cost. Compared to budget, we've talked about this a couple times. We had transfers to streetscapes, transfers to Park and Rec, and those big capital project schedules have been adjusted for the work done and when it was done. And so here is the section, that first set of columns is really where the 99% of those changes are reflected. So we will need a budget amendment later in the year to account for that, but that's because it didn't get spent last year. So when you go back to those two slides comparing fiscal '23 to fiscal '24, here you have a situation where you're over budget, and last year it was under budget significantly because of that timing. So in total, in your non-departmental categories, which also includes your debt service, also includes your community agencies, we budgeted 13.1 million. Year-to-date, it's at about 7.4, and we're gonna probably end the year at 13.9. Or I'm sorry, 13.9. So in total, that's a difference of about $800,000. And just kind of as a recap for anybody at home listening, our general fund revenues, or revenue sources, include your taxes, license fees, service revenue, your intergovernmental revenue, and any special purpose revenue that we have. Taxes include your property taxes, your tangible property taxes, your motor vehicle taxes. Your license and fees include your occupational license fee, which is payroll withholding and net profit. your business license, and interest on any tax payments, your franchise fees, insurance premiums, your alcohol tax permits. Your service revenue includes 911 services provided to others, your school resource officers, fire protection. We did used to include the park and rec allocation there, but we've removed it this year. Your intergovernmental revenue, which is, you have police and fire incentive grants. Currently, we're getting a little bit in and out for one of Josh's grants. It's the Brownfield grants that he's been working with. When we had some ARPA spending last fiscal year, that's where that was recorded. And special purpose revenue would be any sort of bond or debt issuance. And we do like to focus a little bit more on occupational taxes, your license fee, and your net profits, because it is our largest primary source of revenue. If, you know, that is the biggest item we have that we rely on citywide. So I do like to kind of cover your industries, your top 10 taxpayers, what industry they are in. I've also included a comparison of the changes from last tax year. So this is by tax year and not fiscal year. So in 2023, your top taxpayer in your occupational license was your healthcare field. We have the hospital is here. We have lots of medical providers, and they are contributing to your occupational tax dollars. That is followed by education, manufacturing, government, and retail. Last year, if you look comparative, healthcare was also number 1, education was also number 2, manufacturing was number 3. There were a couple miscellaneous odd ones that we had to group together last year, and then retail. So that one overall has stayed the same, but the governmental contributions as employers has made its way up in there this year where it was not last year. So you've also, though, you saw retail drop off or drop back a little bit. And compared to your net profits, your manufacturing industry was your number 1 industry submitting net profit returns last year. It's the same this year. Healthcare is your second this year. So some of the healthcare businesses located here are for profit. Not all of them are. Some of the big ones aren't. They are listed as a nonprofit, but there are quite a few that are for profit, and they have crept their way up compared to other industries that are reporting significant decreases in net profits. Next, we have retail at 8% and then gas and oil at 9%. Both of those are pretty similar to last fiscal year, or I'm sorry, last tax year. But if you look at the little chart at the top, last year you had restaurants, you had construction, you had realty, financial services. None of those were in our top 10 taxpayers this year. So there's just been a very big shift in who's reporting profits versus wages this year.
Real quick, just for me, the other people probably already know this, the other commissioners. What properties in the city of Danville are property tax free?
So anybody who is registered, well, not anybody, any property that is owned by a registered not-for-profit would be tax exempt from those property taxes. So that does include Center College, that does include Ephraim McDowell Hospital. That also would include any buildings that are owned by those entities and that sort of thing.
And public schools as well?
Public schools are not-for-profit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Boyle County would be exempt, City of Danville school system would be exempt. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So where did my tax dollar go? So this is for fiscal $24, where we think by the end of the year it will have gone. 8 cents of your dollar has gone to support your legislative department, 5 cents to your finance department, 3 cents to your IT department, 26 cents to your police department, 20 cents to your fire department, 7 cents to 911, 10 cents to public services, your public works department, 9 cents to debt service, less than 1 cent, 7% of 1 cent to your community agencies, and 11 cents to your non-departmental, which supports other functions of the city. So,
I had one more. Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Could you identify some items that would be in that legislative executive?
that would include your salaries for departmental folks such as Earl, Ashley, Josh, Randy, all of HR, Melanie's salary, the commission's part-time salary plus medical benefits as employees. It would also include legal services, so we're a city, we're a big entity. There's a lot of legal costs that go into that. Certain functions of softwares, like our payroll software essentially gets allocated to, the annual fee gets allocated there. Anytime we do a city, I don't know if sponsor's the right word, but if the city contributes, for instance, to the streetscape ribbon cutting, that is allocated from the legislative budget. You all provide a table at the Brass Band Festival. That's kind of, similar costs. Or if we provide in-kind services to functions that happen around the city, like we give a tent to somebody for the day, that would come from your legislative budget.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
I asked Rick and he didn't know. For the exempt, that's also churches.
Oh, yes, that's also
and
churches.
BCTC.
BCTC is exempt.
Okay, all private schools.
So it would depend on how they are filed for tax purposes.
Okay.
I would presume that they are filed as a nonprofit. 95% of schools, especially in our area that are private, are filed as nonprofit. You may have had some back in the day, if you remember, like there was a little national college. That was a for-profit college. They may or may not have been filed as a nonprofit. There's certain 501Cs and Bs, and I'm not an expert on that. They may or may not have been filed as a tax exempt for-profit, but I think they were probably paying property taxes when they were still around. But all the rest of them, as far as I'm aware, are tax exempt like the regular school systems. But that is me making the assumption based on what I know of them, and I've not seen their particular paperwork in person, so.
I would like to point out, though, too, when you're talking about property taxes, I did, just doing the quick math, your property tax revenue to the city is only 11% of your total city revenue. The occupational taxes, we go back one slide.
Yep.
The occupational and net profit taxes that are shown on this slide represent 80% of the city's revenue. Okay? So it's not as, so the diversity of revenue sources is critical for the city. And so that you can see that while there's some not paying property taxes, you're still collecting chunks of revenue from those agencies. And I think sometimes that's misrepresented. I think and this is a hard message for citizens sometimes. So if you have a citizen, what they think they're paying to the city at that point is just strictly what's on their property tax bill. That's only 10% of the city's revenue to operate on. And I think that's a important thing for the average citizen to understand, that economic vitality of the community of the city is really driven by the other things that happen in the community, right? Which is your hospital operation, which is your bypass development and function in the retail and the commercial and the manufacturing out on Lebanon Road. Those things are those are 80% of our economy here. And I want to make sure that's understood clearly. Property taxes is only 10% of our economy.
And every employee of a nonprofit pays payroll tax.
Absolutely.
So
I think a lot of
that
they-
needs shared too.
Yeah, a lot of folks, I was gonna mention that when, you get your property tax in the mail, it's a big chunk, and you feel the pain of writing that check, right? But those, every pay period you have, that might be weekly, bi-weekly, bi-monthly, every time you get paid, little portion of that is going to the city because that's what is necessary for the city to function, essentially. So it's coming out in smaller chunks over a larger number of people, and so not quite as many people, they don't feel the pain quite as strongly as that property tax check they write each year, so.
Yeah, and I don't know what the ratio is for the county, for example, on education, but the county would have a similar pie chart for their revenue also.
Yeah.
So it's not just property taxes that fund the county either.
Yeah, when I request the information from the tax office, I just get city stuff, but I would be surprised if there's much difference in the ratios. There might be a little bit just because of maybe there are a couple things that are located not in city limits that don't count, but I would be surprised if it's very far off. And that's why we do spend so much time talking about the general fund, and like more slides in it in the presentation are dedicated toward it, just because it is the driver of city functions. Other functions of the city could stand alone in some capacity, but it wouldn't be at the level that they are, frankly, because they get some support from the rest of the city.
Which is why the top right in that slide right there, where you're talking about what industries are paying net profits, that's concerning, because if you see construction suddenly dropped off for us. And I don't know, those are things that then when we're talking about in workforce development for the Development Corporation, it's not just recruiting for manufacturing. What are we doing to start companies here that are small businesses like construction companies? Right? So that is a piece of our economy that our economic development mindset needs to focus on, frankly.
How do we do that?
It's a good question. That's a good conversation for JJ and that team to challenge them, take a leadership role on. I mean, that's your workforce development. That is your incubators for small businesses. That's the education for how to start a small business. What do you do? What's your process look like? I know that dialogue's occurring in the background right now. I was told that yesterday. So we'll continue to observe that and try to support that group as time passes.
I mean, maybe they could come to the commission and give an update, because I've not heard one from economic development. I know they have their own little meetings, but
yes,
I think
yeah.
for the public and for us as a group, it would be nice to hear from them every now and then,
Yeah,
to see
part
what's
of
going on.
Part of that is them developing their budget proposal too, and so they're trying to figure out what their budget needs to look like to impact some of those things. And so that's the conversation that's current. So you'll hear that when they come before the commission, and if not, that's the time you ask.
I guess for me, I know we do this once a year, but during the year, I said that last year, I would still like to hear from people throughout the year, maybe 6 months to say, hey, this is what's going on, this is where we are, we're hitting our goals, we're missing our goals, we're totally out of the water or we're sinking. It would be nice for me to know. I mean, that just may be me, but I would like to hear some things from people during the year.
And Ashley and I have talked about, Ashley's really driving this, like, especially because, economic development, they get a fairly decent sized chunk of change from the city, right? So do some other entities, but even the smaller ones, she's really got on her agenda to get those folks in, mid-year or quarter of the way through or something, just to give an update. So I think she can add in the larger entities, but she did, like, I just want to, because I know she knows you said it, and she's working on it, and I just wanted that to be made aware. Yeah.
JJ's in the audience already most of the time, so,
Yeah, he comes quite a bit.
yeah, so he can.
We'll just invite him up unprompted. He can let us know. So, do you guys have any questions or want to kind of delve into some questions or deeper into any specific areas of the general fund today?
There's a lot of numbers up there.
Yes.
Are those your favorite numbers? Why did they make this? I don't know.
I'm
Kidding. No, I like the process because it always, you drink from a fire hose right now, and then you kind of help us along, narrow it down. So right now, I wouldn't know what to ask you personally. But
Okay.
That's just me.
And like I said at the beginning, well, you'll have the detail in the additional spreadsheets, but especially with this, because it's very different than the last one, I didn't really have a method yet to formulate. Like, the other spreadsheets were old and cumbersome and susceptible to human error, but because they had been done the same way so long, it really was formulaic in how we updated it and how we presented it. And so this is just rethinking a lot of things. And, today, just as we sat down, I said, oh, this would have been really great with some page numbers, right? So we'll be working kind of on that, and you guys will get more detail. The next meeting is department presentation, so you won't get necessarily this full printout with that, but the meeting after, you'll get the full detail of each and every department.
There's a lot of information on that first sheet, though, in that spreadsheet you have. And I would like to, again, looking at the historic trends, thinking about things we talked about in 2021, 22, 23 along the way. We know when we started doing salary adjustments, trying to get to the market. You can follow that progression. We know COVID had a weird impact on net profits, and you really can see that if you go back and look at that historic line. So there's a lot of good information here, and comparing the projected year end versus the actual 2023, I think, again, I'd draw your attention to those two columns, and really, those are two big things.
What just stands out to me is the annual actual in 2020 is 16,000, and then the projected for expenses. And then the projected for 2024 is 31.
Absolutely. So
That's a double, like,
that's
scary double, yeah.
Well, and a lot of that is capital, right? So about 8 to 10 million of
Oh.
that is capital,
I
right?
didn't know that.
But your
Okay.
true departmental expenses probably have gone up about at least, we've gotten at least an additional 2 to 2.5 in medical expenses every year minimum. We've got at least an additional several million in, over the last 5 years, a couple, like 1.5, 2 million in salaries alone, I would say. That doesn't include retirement, which fluctuates and is impacted by your salary. So I think in total, from about 2020, your operations have went up from that 16 million to close to let's see, I'm at the wrong place. Probably close to 20, 21, 22. I'd have to get the math out, get my calculator out.
Yeah,
So it has gone up.
22, but actual 2020 is not a good year to look at all, really. I mean, that's your COVID impact year
Okay.
on expenses. So if you
Gotcha.
average 2019 to 2021, you're looking at 17.98 and 18.058. So that's probably your baseline operating expenses for the city during that period. And then after you do your salary adjustments as you go by, pulling your capital out, you're probably, in the 20 to 22, 22-ish range now.
Okay, well, that's much better. That's
Right.
very balanced. Looks like we're going to bring in 21.7 and operating's 21.
Yeah.
So okay. I didn't understand the capital, which we usually finance.
Correct.
Right, okay.
So, yeah, historically, we financed a lot in the last 5 years. We've just spent some reserves that we've had built up over the last 10, 12 years. So it has gone up, but not the extreme. And I think normally in the previous spreadsheets, we do have like a delineation between operations and and we'll try to get that added in for the future.
I think sounds like we don't see it, but the detail, if you probably looked at the detail in departments, I would say it's not operational. It would be salary,
A lot of
benefits,
salary, yeah.
insurance,
Yes.
things like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is what we're gonna
And
see.
we need to take some time. That's what she and I were talking about this morning. With that new software where it doesn't totalize that, it's something we need to be able to show.
Right.
Because you can, the percentage of cost, that's personnel versus contractual
Operation, right.
versus bills to pay, like
Right.
electric. Those.
I mean, because it always looks like the budgets for the departments themselves, as far as expenditures, are really either under budget or right on. And I would just.
So I'm big on budget, on your departmental line item expenses. For you to understand and control your expenses, that needs to be as accurate as possible. And so like, we inflated some of those department budgets before, 7, 8 years ago. We would inflate some of those budgets for healthcare, for example. I like budgeting that healthcare at the projected cost, and then that inflation number, that max liability, put that in non-departmental so that you can see what your actual expense for healthcare in legislative executive was because of that change with whatever that expense was that year. And so we want to budget those department expenses as accurately as possible,
And with the delineation next time, you'll be able to more clearly see the, personnel costs versus what departments are electing to spend. Because they do truly monitor and keep pretty good track on that.
Can I ask another request?
Absolutely.
Not about the content of the document at all.
Sure.
That general fund revenue sources up there, that slide, it's on 2 pages in our packet. Could I request, especially from my fellow commissioner here, that you do 1 slide per page in our packet? So if we go through, we can have more space to mark on.
Yeah,
right on.
this is.
Oh, it's too
On this-
small.
yeah.
Okay.
I didn't want to say the print was too small for her, but no.
It's too small. I will say, I asked somebody if it was big enough, if the font was big enough, but they were young and I guess their eyes, younger than me. I thought it was too small too, but I thought, well, my eyes aren't good.
I requested more space for notes. I didn't say anything about the size of the font, did I?
Okay. Space for notes. I got you.
You got the message, though, right?
I got the message. I mean, no, you can clearly see me squinting at my own packet to read it, so.
And I know we'll get the detail. But
Yes.
can we get it prior to the meeting, just for me? It helps. I know you're swamped. I know
I-
you got a lot going on.
I will
But
I will
it's nice
try
to be able to
really,
look
really,
at it, like
really
Kevin
hard.
said, to ask
Absolutely,
questions.
absolutely. I will try very, very hard.
Yeah.
I hate to say 100% yes, because something will happen.
I mean, you know, that way we could ask questions. Because if we
Absolutely.
get it all, you can.
Absolutely. I work really hard. That will be my number one priority
And I'm completely the
this
opposite.
next.
I don't want
Tuesday.
it in advance, because if I look at it in advance, I come in more confused.
Well, so that's the other side of
I want you to explain it
it.
to me first.
That's the other side of that.
Don't look at yours.
That-
Don't look at it.
That's the other order of that. So on one hand, you're being given the information, you go back away from the meeting, come back next
Yeah.
week, and then over the course of time, you may come in and sit down and say, look, I looked at this spreadsheet, and this makes absolutely no sense to me. But, so we have always presented that and then allowed you plenty of time to ask questions before I get it. I understand, yeah, that's totally,
Just
yeah.
either way, I mean,
Yeah.
whatever.
No,
Or
I
maybe
will
at the
work on
next
that.
meeting Have a little question time.
The ideal scenario is not that I'm tweaking it the night before, but that has
Yeah.
unfortunately,
So we
been the
can,
case.
we can be more intentional too, to
Yes.
start the next meeting with, did you have any questions from the
Yeah,
spreadsheets
maybe
from
the
last
previous
time?
one, yeah.
And really open that up a little bit. We don't spend enough time maybe asking that question either.
I have another question.
yes.
Okay, I need a mental refresher this early. What are the capital projects? I know the police department,
Current year capital projects?
right here for the general fund.
I don't know which one are you pointing out last
Well-
year or this year?
In 2024, if there's
Okay.
8 to 10 million, what were they?
Okay, so 2024,
What are
your general fund capital
Yeah.
is at budgeted 1.4. Some of that's equipment, some of that is the police design renovations.
non-departmental stuff.
But the non-departmental, right, so that includes streetscapes of about, we've did the budget amendment for that already, 2 million-ish in total spending this year. 90% of the work is already done, but those last expenses get wrapped up. And then the rest, well, not the rest, but the other majority is Park and Rec. You have Jenny Rogers. I think in total, it's gonna be about $2.5 million that have been spent this year on Jenny Rogers. The rest was last year. You have Michael Smith Park at $1 million, 1.1. You also have design work on Bunny Davis improvements. You have, am I forgetting anything big, Josh?
Yeah, and the police thing.
Oh, yeah, we finished the tennis courts. Those got wrapped up in the current fiscal year.
The Public Works building.
The Public Works building.
There's a laundry.
And all that's in 2024.
Yeah.
Equaling 10 million.
Yeah, so like the dollars kind of have lagged a little bit.
Yeah.
The construction process is just taking a lot longer than it normally would have, just due to outside circumstances. So there's a lot.
And that's,
It is.
and
Very
that,
good.
all of those things are just really positives for
Absolutely.
staff, but more importantly, positives for our community, because the community is benefiting from all the things you just identified, so that's great.
Absolutely,
Getting them paid for, obviously, so. Okay, good questions.
yeah. All right, so we will move on to, so I do have the next set of slides. I didn't cover in slides. We have the municipal aid fund, that is your normal paving. We get funds from the state from the gas tax. We get an allocated portion of that every year, about close to $350,000. We've done paving for the year at this point already, so that's really wrapped up. We had tentatively budgeted in that one a grant that, for some capital work, but that was allocated to the projects going on with the EDA. So we're not gonna actually end up getting that, but that grant was accepted. So I don't know if I phrased that correctly. Yeah, the PDI grant that the EDA is working through. We had originally thought the city would have to get it and then give it to the EDA, but that's not how it's worked. So, paving is wrapped up. Police safety fund, we budgeted $6,000 in highway safety funds and approximately that in $7,000 in expenditures. That is from the Department of Transportation at the, in the Highway Safety Department. The police have a small grant they get annually to help offset some expenses related to traffic control, things of that nature. So that's fully grant funds and a little bit of interest, but it's a very small separate fund. Your drug forfeiture fund, we budgeted $5,000, we've gotten 7.5. That really fluctuates significantly based on police activity. We don't have any kind of control or pre-knowledge of when those funds are going to come in. That comes from your circuit court clerk. And then the expenses related are tied directly to offset drug enforcement activity. So it's very structured on what can be spent on and what's not. It's very small as well. So streetscape is just a capital projects tracking fund, essentially, on activity related to improvements of your streets and sidewalks around the city. Originally, the budget was 1.1-ish million. We did the budget amendment earlier this year for the expense catch-up to 2.15. We will end right about there. We've got the final pay-up coming from that project coming soon. So in total, we have spent about 1.7 million this fiscal year on the project. Okay. So, Park and Rec. And I just fly through those funds because frankly, they're just not that interesting and to me, they're kind of routine. But if you guys have questions, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to Earl and me afterwards, and we can answer any that come up for that. So, Park and Recreation. Fiscal year 22-23. So on the slides, I've separated your park-generated funds versus your contributions from other sources. Just to kind of, because all of them kind of, other than the part that just goes to capital, relates to operations, but they're very different in their source. So I thought that this was a little bit more meaningful than kind of how we've broken them apart in previous years. As of fiscal 22-23, we've only had that was the third year budgeting for that fund. So I'm really excited for Tommy to be here to help kind of better budget those revenues, because we really just had not yet done a good job of predicting what we would do in true park generated revenue. So in fiscal 22-23, we did exceed what we budgeted quite a bit in your park program revenue, which includes your sports sign-up fees. They had some adult leagues, things like that, all get rolled into the park program revenue. We did, they exceeded their rental budget. We rent the room in the Bunny Davis building, shelter rentals, that kind of thing. Service fees, which include service fees to utilize the gym at Bunny Davis, your concessions. They did really well last fiscal year, and your sponsorships and sales were pretty well right on target. So in total, Those get added in with your contributions from your other sources, which include the city. It includes the Boyle County Fiscal Courts, and you get a few small grants throughout, like tree grants, things like that, that are received. In total, in fiscal year '23, you had $6 million in revenue. The largest source of that was transfers from the city, and it was transfers for capital. So that gets included as a revenue. Your other larger source is your Boyle County fiscal court contribution. Last year was $344,000. And then your park program revenue that we discussed makes up the rest. So here we've broken it out. Capital contributions is that first column. Again, like you saw in transfers from last year, the budget is significantly over what we actually spent because those project schedules changed. So it all flows together. That next column is our budgets for operations. So we did spend a little bit more than we anticipated based on budget for operations from the city's general fund, just because frankly, we just didn't we didn't have a significant history budgeting for expenses, and we also made it a priority to do some things that we hadn't done in previous years that had been lacking. So those operating costs were a little bit more than we had planned. Overall, $6 million in total revenue-wise for last fiscal year. So your expense side, your operating expenses include, it does say debt service, but I want to make that clear. That is for fleet vehicles. That's not any bond or debt issuance in that manner. For Park and Recreation, they have some vehicles which is considered debt service. So that cost is tied in there. Your Millennium Park budget was at $841,000 actual dollars last year. Your fitness center was at $407,000 last fiscal year. Your pool ended at $102,000, and then your other community parks is kind of lumped together at $72,000. And then over on the separate chart, I broke those out because of the scale of them. You budgeted right at close to $9 million in capital, and you came in at about half that in fiscal 22-23. So in total, your expenditures for Park and Rec Fund were $5.3 million. 3.9 of that was capital expenses. So compared to the current year, you have you have our budget in the green, where we are at year to date, and where we think we're going to be at the end of this fiscal year for your same categories as your park generated revenue versus your contributions from other sources. The park program revenue, especially with some new programs that Tommy has and the tournaments that Tommy has started, bringing those in, we're expecting to exceed our budget pretty well in most categories. I think our rentals are slightly under budget. That's just probably a function of us not having that lined out at the time we created the park budget. But overall, your budget for program revenue, we think will be quite over budget at $167,000 compared to budget of $140,000. Concessions as well, we budgeted $85,000. We think we'll probably end up at $116,000. Same for sponsorships and sales. We budgeted $35,000. We think it'll probably be close to $37,000 based on just history and things of that nature. Your other contributions from intergovernmental sources, the county, like we had talked earlier, is their current year contribution is $366,935. And if you're looking between budget versus actual versus projected, it does say 0 in current, and I just want to make that clear verbally for everybody. It's not that they haven't contributed anything this year. They have. It's still in the general fund, and with that budget transfer, it will be moved. But they have contributed. They contribute quarterly. They have 1 quarter left of the year that they will still contribute. So they are at 3/4 of the way there. But by the end of the year, once we get that budget amendment completed, the total balance will be $366,935. We're not really talking future yet, but the agreement that we have with them, it gets increased by COLA from DLG, which is 3.4%. So that will be their contribution for operations. Next year, any other contributions have not been agreed upon or discussed, and I will leave that to Earl and Josh to handle in future meetings.
And I'm sure Tommy will cover this when it gets to departmental budgets, but diving into what those mean, your program revenue in Parks and Recreation for building rentals, all revenue generated concessions out of Parks and Recreation is about $410,000 against an operating expenses for what it looks like baseline operating expenses, which are about 1.6. So we have to close that gap up, right? So you're running, and that's okay. That it's a quality of life expenditure. We know that it's always going to you're always going to spend more on those things than you're generating revenue. There's green space that you have to maintain that's quietly enjoyed that will never generate revenue. Like you're not going to charge people at the gate to walk in Wisiger Park, for example, Wisiger Plaza. So the expenses to control all the parks is about $1.6 million against revenue generated out of the parks of $410,000. So hopefully Tommy can close that gap up just a little bit. If he can generate $110,000 more over time, that's a big deal for the community, right? So I know that's a challenge to him, and he didn't get to hear that before the meeting. But so, Tommy, what's your idea? What are you going to do, Tommy? To go over step 1, 2, 3. Just kidding. So thank you.
Tommy said that wasn't high enough, Earl.
I guess my thing would be, again, I know we probably talk about it at the end, but while the county is creating their budget, it might be helpful to ask them if there's any thought of contributing more to the parks budget.
Yeah, so
Before
the
they
discussion at the
finalize.
time was so we have Cowan Street, Jackson Park.
Right.
So we're spending money in parks at the county. Same time, we don't see really what they spend on Constitution, for example. Or, so then we know that. But, two, we do need to issue a memo, and I was going to tell Josh and Tommy this, based on the parks meeting that we had, we had our takeaway of marching orders. So we need to quantify that in a memo for you guys and let you all ratify. We know we need to develop this community indoor space. We know that's a priority, right? Well, I want to confirm that and let you all see that in writing and say, okay, yes, that's what we understood both parties agreed to. And we need to give that to the county and let them endorse that. And then if they want to spend money towards that agenda, then that gives them something to talk about. So they need, maybe the county wants to allocate money towards design services this year to support some of those enterprises. So that's a follow-up conversation we have to have, and it may result in another workshop with the city and county to ratify that together.
I thought we were going to have.
That's why I'm bringing that up. I just
Okay.
want you to know that that's not lost yet. We've got to come back and we've got to make sure that you all tell us exactly what you heard that day, what you told us that day, make sure we understood what you all were saying that day. And then the county needs to tell us what they want to do towards that agenda financially.
Their donation is earmarked for Millennium Park and Bunny Davis.
Bunny Davis and the pool is noted in the agreement, Bunny Davis is noted in the agreement, and Millennium Park.
Yeah.
You know, that the Bunny Davis Center costs a lot, and you don't have a lot of membership there. And so that's, although the facility is, you know, it's got the pool, you know, it's got the pickleball courts, you know, maybe if you reinvest in pickleball, there's an empty property there. There's a lot to talk about tied to that location and how it's managed and what the expenses are there.
I just always look at it and I add those three things, Millennium plus fitness plus pool is 1.3 million. So it'd be great to split more than 366, so. Anyway, there's a lot of nice people over there that I think, and hearing it from Tommy, I don't know who's the appropriate person to hear it from, but if the expenses have gone up that much, and we all want to support our kids at Millennium Park and, you know, the pool.
And I think from our last parks meeting, I talked to, you know, the judge, and I think maybe they don't understand, or some people might not, that even the skateboard park, which needs updated, the county sort of withdrew from years ago and doesn't want, you know, and she didn't know that. So it's like, those are things that maybe they would put more money in. I don't know. I mean, it's just a.
Yeah, you have the baseline operating expenses that are not covered by program revenue, which those are the big revenue generators for that $410,000 really comes out of those three locations, really, to be honest. And so when you pull that out, you're looking at about $850,000 that of direct expenses that the county's partnering on. And so they're partnering on 366 of that 850 right now, to be precise, or more precise, I guess.
Yeah, I got 890, so that would be
Yeah.
maybe 450 each.
Yeah.
Would be great.
Yeah.
And I think the point that Earl's trying to make also, also is that as we develop new activities, new locations, new projects, like the Michael Smith renovation and all the new playground facilities, you know, we don't go around and check to see the license plates on the cars who are using those facilities.
Right.
They're all in the county.
Right.
It's city parks, but they're all, it's city and county parks. We don't separate them anymore.
Well, and the goal too would be, you know, make sure that 1.3 million is what it needs to be. If it can be lower, and then out of that 889, you know, if Tommy can generate, if that 410 instead of it being 410 turns into 510, that's a big impact on what the city and county need to split, right? So you kind of see how that when I'm saying that number, that's a big number. Though when you're looking at the city's overall budget, you're like, well, that's not a big, maybe he needs to have a larger target. No, if he can generate $100,000 more in revenue, that's a big impact on the city and county, right? So, and I'm not nowhere challenging you to do that. I'm just like speaking in terms of round numbers anecdotally. Right?
And I will throw in, the contribution amount that's set by the agreement was crafted in late fiscal year 19, 20, something like that. So it didn't have those big inflation dollars built into it. It didn't, and I mean, we do have a cost of living adjustment, but also the city made an effort to increase salaries, which includes your part-time folks. So all that stuff kind of necessarily, the agreement doesn't have that built in to it. I do think there's, you know, the agreement gets reviewed every 5 years? So, you know, the discussion will have different parameters when it happens that, again, than when it was set, essentially. So we're starting from different points when the point comes to renegotiate that contract, if and when it comes. So we kind of touched a little bit on it, operating expenditures the current year. We are going to be over budget. Number one, in debt service, that just got missed by staff budgeting in the last couple of years. We have made sure to build that in for the fleet vehicles. Millennium Park, the 90% of the overage, it's not on, once you guys see the breakdown individually, it's not, it's 90% is in salaries and personnel cost for all of those departments. But you are projected to be over budget in the fund total by about $1 million. And we will have a budget amendment that addresses that before the end of the fiscal year. So in total expenditures, including capital, 5.9 million. Or I'm sorry, 7.5 million, 5.9 is capital. I apologize, I misspoke.
Just kudos to Tommy, and also, this is probably the biggest thing the community is excited about. So this is exciting.
Absolutely, like
time,
there
so.
is a lot that's been a result of those dollars being spent. Even things, little things that get wrapped up, 20, I'm estimating, I don't know the dollar amount offhand, $20,000 in improvements in paint and door handles at Bunny Davis makes a big impact when, with a little bit of manpower to get it done. So, by the end of the fiscal year, compared to where we started from, they've done a lot. And kudos to Josh and Tommy for doing a lot of hard work. So, I mean, the dollars are there to reflect the work they did, but they did a lot of hard work and a lot of impacts that the community will see. So.
And in the long run, saved us money.
Well,
lot of preventive
absolutely.
steps,
There's,
yeah.
and some of it has been that, frankly, maintenance-wise, they didn't spend it in years past, and so you've got to kind of get it back to where it is easy and maintainable on some things. So some of it is just 15 years of I'm throwing out the year, but if something wasn't updated quite as frequently as it should have been or kept in a certain manner, it takes a lot more than a routine maintenance cleaning would, for example. Do y'all have any other questions or comments about the Park and Rec Fund? We will move on to Cemetery Fund. So revenue-wise, you have 3 categories of major revenue: your transfers from the general fund, your services, which includes the sale of graves and your burials, and your other miscellaneous, which includes interest, et cetera. Fiscal year '23 ended the year with $337,000 in revenue. That is slightly above where we budgeted. Your expenditures for the cemetery fund include your personnel, your contract services, which includes mowing contract, which is fairly large, other in general, and debt service, which is your fleet vehicles for this particular fund. In total, we budgeted in fiscal year '23. We were slightly above budget in personnel, which it did include some medical costs, and the mowing contract came in for that particular fiscal year quite a bit more than we had planned, but your other categories were under budget. We ended fiscal year '24 at $408,748. And I'll get through the rest of this fund. Do you guys need a break after that? Okay, so I'll get through this one. Cemetery is pretty small as well. So current fiscal year revenues, we've budgeted at $400,000. Year-to-date, we're at about $255,000. We are estimating slightly under budget at $387,000. There weren't quite as many grave sales as anticipated, but that's always a good thing, right? Your year-to-date expenses, capital-wise, we did not spend what we had budgeted for. If you remember, we did bid out a committal shelter It came in significantly over budget, so we've pulled back on that, and Josh is kind of reevaluating. Personnel cost, again, because we budget to expected medical costs hits everybody. I think that one, I feel like I'm a parrot repeating myself, but that one hits a lot. Your contract services are pretty well right on track. Your other is as well as your debt service compared to budget. So we plan to end the year at 434,418, well under budget, mostly due to the capital expenses. Do you guys have any questions about the cemetery fund?
Hopefully
That
we
includes
can-
Hilldale and Bellevue cemeteries.
I mean, and hopefully we can look at the committal stuff again, the committal shelters, maybe, look
Yeah.
at the wall next door. I think that was, and I know the staff is swamped, but they did a great job.
Well, I think he's still been looking at it. It's just trying to figure out what is affordable and what
Right.
we can do. So I think that'll probably be one we talk about when we talk about current year capital.
Because I was out there, I guess there was a funeral and it was rainy and, in the tent and it's just a lot, so,
Yeah.
you know.
We got to get the committee sort of back on board too, don't we?
They want to meet with us, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So would you like to take a break, 5-minute?
It's a consensus that we take a 5-minute break.
You guys just look a little restless, and I'm just over here rattling off
Well,
numbers.
Rick hadn't said anything in a long time, so, you okay, Rick?
So that is a billed service through the utility department, but that manage your stormwater program. 99% of revenues generated from the stormwater are the stormwater fees that are collected with a small amount of interest. Fiscal year '23, we came in slightly under budget for service revenue and over budget for interest collection. We ended the year at $592,000. On the expense side, those categories of expenses, your personnel, contract, other debt service, were, other than personnel, which was slightly over budget, and your other category, which is very small, was over budget. In total, you ended the year at $503,000. Which was under where we budgeted in total. You have a little bit of debt service related to some old infrastructure within that fund, along with your fleet vehicle. Current year, you are budgeted to end the year in revenue at $600,500. Year-to-date, we're at about $474,000. And we're estimated to end the year at $628,000. I know earlier in the year, Josh had staff do a bit of an audit, right, on stormwater, just to make sure we're charging the appropriate amount to the appropriate people. And that is a very stable, positive fund. Expenses for the year are under budget. Part of that is for a significant portion of the year, Josh had a position open in stormwater, which I believe has been filled and will be starting soon in the next month or so. You were also under budget in capital. He had originally planned a project that he's been doing a little bit of work on the back end with planning. So coming soon, you'll see maybe a big infrastructure project for the stormwater funds. Budgeted for the year was $1.1 million in expenses. We estimate we'll end the year at about $784,000. So the garbage fund detail is in your packet. I didn't hit a slide for that, since it's just the service fees for the garbage service, along with the contract that the county provides for us for recycling. They've worked a lot on auditing garbage accounts that are billed. There have been some, and you all may or may not remember, some meetings with our garbage provider. There have been some meetings about the contracts with who we're billing and making sure we're billing the appropriate number of houses and the appropriate number of cans to the appropriate number of houses. So I've done a lot of work in that this year to make sure that the appropriate people are charged the appropriate number of trash cans, which is very hard when you consider rental services, people moving in and out, and who pays for that trash service, and et cetera. So there's been a lot of work ongoing in that, and that they've made a lot of improvements, especially in the last 3 or 4 months on those.
Leah,
Yes.
do we know how many customers they're servicing?
Customers? 6,500-ish. And that's not necessarily even the number of trash cans, because
I know, yeah.
a lot of people have 2. And then there's the weird downtown service.
Yeah. I just know we always hear 11,000 people from the water?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head how many customers we have, but we can find out. It shouldn't be too hard to pull that out of the billing system. Yeah.
And the grant, the recycling is the county,
That is our
right?
agreement with the
And
county.
what do we get for that?
That's your contribution for the solid waste coordinator position.
Salary?
Yeah. Honestly,
Okay.
That's a contract, I forget when it ends, but it's a 10-year
Right.
set fee contract. And we will move on to utilities, since that is our second largest fund, and so we can get that one in parking and then open it up for any questions you guys have. Your utility fund fiscal year '23 year-end wrap-up, your operations consist primarily of water and sewer charges plus some additional operating charges from your utility billing, which include turn-on fees or a bit of labor or, there are things like that that get assessed, but your biggest category is water and sewer by far. So in total, you were, that always fluctuates a little bit compared to budget. You were slightly under budget in water, slightly over budget in sewer, in revenue, and right on track with the others for the most part. And in total, your operating revenue in the utility fund for fiscal year '23 was $11.4 million. This was operating, I apologize, I skipped to operating expenses. So your operating expenses are what it takes to make the water and sewer system run throughout our entire system. That includes the administration of it, your water treatment plants, your sewer plants, et cetera. Those have had some fluctuations in your operations. One of the biggest drivers in that we've seen over fiscal year '23 is your chemical bid costs. Chemical costs have skyrocketed. We're seeing that this year as well. I encourage you guys, one of the times, if you are available, to come watch our chemical bid. It's a very fascinating reverse bid process, and it does help keep the cost low, but they have just skyrocketed, and I would presume that that's industry-wide in water and sewer and not just something localized to central Kentucky. But that is my speculation, not facts. I was hoping Marshall would nod, but he didn't.
Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, you hear us talk all the time about COVID, right? And, you have a spike in COVID prices in the marketplace and stuff like chemicals and machinery and electronics early in that discussion. When COVID first struck back in 2020, 2021, that was the height of it. And I think you see an early spike in that, but as that progresses throughout the market, you'll see it'll take a long time, if ever, that adjusts back down to where it was. I mean, that's just something that I think we just need to come to the understanding that a lot of what you saw pre-COVID is never going to happen in the market. So it takes time to build that out into the budget and show itself in the market.
So when you look at your non-operating revenues and your non-operating expenses, that pulls in things minimally in the utility fund, things like interest on accounts that we have, but it also includes any sort of grant funding, debt service, or, new debt financing, things like that tend to go along with the capital projects. In fiscal '23, we did budget a very large non-operating portion, close to $18 million, which we did not realize because of timing of some of the projects that Marshall had ongoing, that he's still working on. Some of those, especially when they're through the state, it's heavily based on the state's funding cycle and when those funds are allocated. And he's got several things that we think will be realized by the end of this fiscal year, some KIA funding. We've had some discussions, there's some EPA funding, things of that nature. There was a bond issuance originally budgeted for fiscal '23 that we did complete in fiscal '24. So compared to your non-operating expenses, that includes, they have a non-departmental section. We also budget there for medical costs like we do in the general fund, your debt service, and then your capital work. So in total, Last fiscal year, you had about $11 million in capital spending. I do want to make a quick note, compared to your spreadsheet, that capital number is 0 on your spreadsheet. It is not on this chart, and that's a function of accounting that I don't want to go too deeply into because I don't think you guys would enjoy that. But it essentially gets that capital, those capital projects, like for instance, improvements on the wastewater treatment plant that Marshall's been working on. That gets moved from a expense line in your accounting function to an asset line, to your work in process, that doesn't populate in normal revenues and expenses budgeting. So last year, fiscal, and you look back historically, we didn't spend $7,000 in capital in 2022. We didn't spend $5,000 in capital in 2021. We didn't spend 0 in capital in the utility fund in 2023. For the next spreadsheet, I'll try to better quantify for you what we did spend, but last year it was about $11 million, and that's all on big projects that have either, that I think one wrapped up, the tail end of a project wrapped up last year, dollar-wise, and several are ongoing. Currently, your water and sewer revenues, we have budgeted about $12 million in operations, operating water, sewer, other billed charges. Year-to-date, we're at about $8.5 million. We do estimate we're going to be slightly under budget at 11.4. That can fluctuate based on usage, which is heavily dependent on a lot of things outside of what the control of city staff, essentially. Usage is tied to weather. It can be tied to other things.
Did we, and help me remember this, we did, I'll say it like this, part of that water revenue side was Springfield, where we've not made that connection yet either, which is still ongoing.
Yep. So part of that, we have a project with Springfield's water district, I think that's the correct term, name for it, and we have an agreement in place that once we get our connection to them, we will sell wholesale. Like in other funds, those schedules have been impacted just by other factors in the economy that we can't control. And once that is wrapped up, that will, that increases a minimum amount of guaranteed revenue for that wholesale connection. It also is tied to, we contributed to this capital project for that purpose to help give them a secondary source of supply for them. So operating expenses for the current year, again, you see especially in the water plant that chemical cost is a little elevated. We've had a lot of medical costs as well. Even if you don't have a catastrophic medical event, the expected versus the actual will impact those budgets on an individual level. Year-to-date operating, we budgeted $8.1 million. We'll probably be closer in operations to 8.4, primarily for those reasons. Your non-operating, again, your non-operating revenue, we have issued that bond issuance, that bond anticipation note back in October. There are some other KIA EPA funds that, while we've been approved for them and some that are still waiting on approval, it's not likely that we will get the dollars in by the end of this fiscal year. Those will probably be split, just based on timelines. But they're still working on in the background. They just take longer sometimes than we would prefer.
And to Lee's point, just for the point of clarity, we just got the green light on 2 projects with KIA, the state revolving fund loans, early this year. That was fiscal 23 one, that they're just now getting around to provision to the public, right? And on the back of that is yet another fiscal 24 provision that's going to happen probably this year, I think it was maybe January or so, I mean, we got the SRF money for over $7 million worth of capital work. But it's not gonna show up just yet, because we actually
Right.
haven't done the projects and
Yeah, so we'll get that 7 million. We originally thought we would get it sooner, but it just is taking, between the state and the federal government, it takes longer than we would prefer to get that in. Capital or non-operating expenses, your non-departmental expenses include a kind of catch for your cost for medical, your total cost. You have the contribution to the city's general fund is included in that section. It's going to be slightly under budget. That kind of nets with the operations to bring those back to flat. Your debt service is on track for the utility fund. And then your capital work, they've done a lot of work on a lot of projects. We'll still end the year under budget a bit by about close to 900,000, close to $1 million, probably by the time the year is wrapped up on things like the Phase 3 of the Perryville Road project, the wastewater treatment plant I think they did a walkthrough on that phase of the project recently. So those kind of things are just getting finalized in this year with some new projects getting started. So in total, total expenses for the general fund at 20.1 million by the end of the current fiscal year. That's operations and capital. So your utility fund revenue sources, just as a recap, operating revenue includes your water service, sewer service, surcharges, tap fees, labor, turn-on fees. There are a few miscellaneous items. Non-operations include interest, tower rentals, any outside funding sources for loans or bond issuances and grants. Your revenues versus appropriations for the year, you budgeted total revenues of 23 million and appropriations of 21. Do you guys have any questions? I know that was quick, but I know I've kind of exceeded my timeline earlier today.
Earl, isn't, like within the utility fund, doesn't sewer pay for sewer, or isn't that the fault anyway?
Yeah, it's a separate charge, it's a separate expense, it's a separate operating expense that rate is driven from.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a percentage of the water revenue, all of that stuff. It's a individual rate. It's measured by your consumption of water. Theoretically, that's what you're sending back at your home and industry, right, as processed water, finished processed water. And the calculation is based on the cost to operate the wastewater plant, cost to operate the collection system. That's the basis for the sewer, yes. So the sewer operates, we want to demonstrate that the sewer breaks even and that the water breaks even over time.
And the revenue, the non-operating revenue, is that the water that we sell, the wholesale?
Oh, non-operating? So
I mean-
wholesale does get included in water sales. So the water sale line, the water sales, and that's operations. Wholesale is, yeah. So any kind of water coming out of anywhere is operating for
Yeah,
us.
operating on the utility side
Yeah.
is derivative of actions of service. The non-operating is not that. It's tower rental. It's the
Yeah.
fact that the utility's there, we're charging rent for it.
Or literally interest on the bank accounts related to utility fund.
And we
So.
sell to how many places right now? I
Well-
think I asked that, I mean, just a overview of.
Traditionally, we sell to Parksville, Lake Village. Gary County's a customer, although they've they're not buying any right now, that, so far as I know, with Lancaster's improvements, but that can come back. Stanford bought some water this year. Houstonville is going to make a connection through Junction City, and you're going to pick up Springfield Utility Commission. North Mercer Water District's connected through Perryville now on 68, and I think they've started buying a little bit of water there now that the water tower's put in hydraulically. That works for them. And so you've got, you know, Gary County's decreased, Springfield's going to add it, Houstonville's added, North Mercer's added. It's definitely a regional asset, and your reach is extensive.
I think people need to know that, how far out we go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a break-even type operation?
That's the goal, and it's, it is the backbone of your economy, frankly. And so yeah, the water utility is not a profit center. It's not a for-profit utility. It's a cost-to-serve basis rate, and that's what it's always been. It's never been a revenue center. There was an effort in the late 80s to consider that, and the commission ultimately, after discussions with some of its customers, went the opposite direction and maintained the idea that it's a break-even operation.
It's a public service.
It's a public service, right? And when you're looking at, and frankly, you have private utilities around us, and, and I don't want to talk negatively about that, but there's, it is my belief that water and sewer and electric should be municipal owned, frankly. That's where it belongs. It's a commodity that you have to have to live. And to me, it's not, it is not something that should be a for-profit stock-held thing. I mean, it's just too essential to life, and it's too, it seems like that's not healthy.
And we'll have, like every other fund, we'll have the detail out for the meeting after the department presentations, so that you can see line by line. And it'll show a little more clear what's capital versus what's operations, things like that. You do have a museum fund. We won't really go into detail. It's very minor. We don't have any big, changes to report from fiscal year 2024. If you remember, fiscal year 23 is when we purchased the additional building that was processed through the museum fund. But otherwise, it's just maintenance, routine maintenance on both buildings that the city owns, HVAC systems work, et cetera, any electric bills, that kind of thing. The full funding, really, other than the minor interest, is transfers from the city's general fund. So parking is your last fund we're going to cover today. Fiscal year 23, we came in slightly under budget on our operating revenues. Part of that was a little bit of a transition between the lots that were available space-wise when we opened those up to customers for downtown, when we had those Main Street blocked off during streetscape work. So we did see a little bit of an impact in operating revenues on that. The picture does make it look like a big elevation, but when you look at actual dollar-wise, that's just it's really not that different. It's just the scale on the photo is kind of large. Total revenue in fiscal 23 for the parking fund, which included transfers from the general fund, was $585,629. Total expenses that fiscal year were $494,360. Including your personnel at $49,000, your contract services at $143,000, Other, which is a catch-all, we had some work done in fiscal year '23, which included some maintenance on the elevator, things like that, at $199,000. And then your debt service at, according to its debt schedule, that gets lumped in to, it's another accounting. I think I'm going to give you guys an accounting lesson on GASB accounting in a couple meetings, just because the budgeted debt service versus the actual for fiscal '23, it looks like we budgeted significantly more in photos and in dollars than we did for debt service, but some adjustments that are required split that apart. So your interest expense related to debt, which is way too in-depth, I feel like, of accounting information for this point in this meeting, but it gets broken apart, and it looks like we budgeted way more in debt service than we spent, but we didn't. It was probably going to be pretty close to the penny. But it just doesn't show in this visual. Current year revenues, we budgeted at $544,000. We're projected to be at $575,000. That overage is a little bit in our operations because of a increase in rates that was required by some of the lease schedules in our operation of the garage. Part of it is also we had some unexpected expenses. If you all remember, we did a budget amendment earlier this year that included a little bit for the parking garage, and so that is also elevated compared to where we originally budgeted. Expenses for the current year is budgeted at $544,000. We think we will end the year at $544,000, right on track budget. If you can see the debt service, it looks like what you think it should because those year-end adjustments have not been made, right on track. But comparatively, your personnel costs are slightly above where we budgeted. Your contract services which is why we did the budget amendment to some more improvements at the garage on the elevator, and the face of it, are a little bit above where we originally budgeted. And then your capital, Josh and Tony have had some improvements they've been working on. So, long story long, we plan to be right on track with the parking fund. So I know that was a lot, all in a couple hours, and we hit those last several really quickly because we spent a lot of time on general fund and on park and rec, things like that. Do you guys have any questions about the parking fund, or is there anything specific? I've been taking notes about what you guys would like to see maybe next time. Is there anything we can cover?
Yeah, that was going to be my question too. So as y'all start to respond, we've done this several times now, a couple times together. We see it a certain way, organized a certain way. We see it presented in a linear fashion for us. If you want us to diverge from that, if you want to see something totally different, if you want to see it presented, customized a little bit differently for you, share that with us and give us a little bit of insight. But otherwise, you're going to get the same path that we see. You've heard me talk about it now 3 or 4 times, some of you. Change me up. I'm willing to adapt to what, if you all don't like that format, just tell us what you want to see differently. So go ahead.
Absolutely.
I'm good myself. I just have a hard time reading it.
That's one, I've wrote it down. That's on my list. That's on my list.
I do have one question, though. And I guess my best example would be the utility fund. Explain the fund balance to me.
So that is going to be, Earl and I talked about that this morning. A fund balance based on the spreadsheet and based on what some of the general folks that don't know accounting and don't know government accounting, which is specific, would think that that is cash money in the bank. And that is not what that is. Your fund balance is a combination of your net investment in capital assets plus some cash. So the biggest majority of that, that's not to say that the utility fund had where am I?
23 million.
$33 million at the beginning of the year, $24 million at the end of last fiscal year, sitting in a bank
Yes,
somewhere.
yes.
That is not what that is.
Yes.
That means that there was X number of dollars in a bank somewhere, plus an investment into capital assets of many millions of dollars elsewhere.
Yeah, most of us are already obligated.
Yes, and a lot of that, the money, like a lot of it is a true, it's an asset on the ground somewhere, right? You know, it took $10 million to do the, I don't know how much the water plant costs, but it took X million dollars of water to make the water plant 10 years ago. And it has depreciated over time, which reduces that original investment. And you have this leftover asset. So we literally talked about this morning, that this could be confusing when you just look at numbers together, because it's not cash in a bank. So-
Legally cash, though, you gotta have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%.
Do we have on hand, right? So you do have to have, and that's another way the ordinance is set up, in a way accounting is, they do say that you should keep a fund balance minimum, and I did include that. And it's calculated based on your minimum of your expenses. So in the utility fund, historically, that's been total of all expenses, because you have to keep up with that infrastructure. But the way that our ordinance is written and the way that it is generally done for accounting purposes, that the minimum fund balance does not also equate to dollars in a bank account as a reserve. So,
Well, and there's some more funds too, like your, you know, some of your long-term debt has accounts to it that are reserved accounts. They're not necessarily, your fund balance theoretically needs to be unrestricted. So that you may have money over here that's not counted. So we do that cash report. If you'll remember, we do the cash position summary sheet that we did last year of all bank account balances. Like, so we take a minute to do that, just so you kind of see it all. We used to spend, and Donna will remember this, we used to take time, the frustrating thing for me on the utility fund, for example, where it shows capital of $0 a couple years, we always worked really hard to make that spreadsheet kind of as accurate as possible. If you go back and try to pull the report out of the computer, it won't match that because you've had accounting adjustments to it. And so we've got to make sure, she and I have to make sure that what we give you, you can interpret as, okay, this was unadjusted. This is what you spend in this line item without the adjustment. This is what the actual, so we got to make sure we continue to do that. This is the new software, so we're learning what the new software is spitting out, which is what she and I was talking about this morning. I want to make sure that we tidy that presentation up a little bit, but we'll still do that cash report. So you'll know when we do that. It's usually later on in the process when we get towards summarizing new expenses with new capital, when we're, you know, usually when we generate that cash report, because it is a little bit of work for her. And so just footnote it like that. We know we want to communicate effectively what our cash position is in these funds. Is that right, Donna? Yeah.
does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am.
More than answer?
Yes, ma'am. And I could read it too, the print.
You could
so
see
I
that
could
one?
read it.
I did increase the font size on this one.
it too.
Okay, any other questions or comments from the commission?
Yeah, you mentioned you were going to summarize later. Can you make a summary today at all? Summary comment?
Of today. I think my summary is, especially considering we looked back at fiscal '23 and where we're at today, is that any kind of budget overages that we've had are kind of ones that we've seen coming with inflation, we've seen coming with medical costs, we've seen project schedules get changed around, and that overall, the things within city staff control for their individual departments, they really control those to the best of their abilities. You know, and I just want to commend them all for doing that. That's my kind of overall,
Looking at the end of fiscal year '23 and looking at where we're projecting right now at the end of this year, the city's in good financial condition.
That's what he wanted to hear.
I mean, that's just
Yeah.
true. And we are spending money because we're in a good financial position. So for example, the Memorial Plaza next door that Donna was talking about, you know, that we're working on that because we have that money available to invest in that as a community asset looking forward, right? Certainly, we have to be mindful at all times, especially moving forward now that we can see the occupational taxes and that kind of thing leveling back out. Okay, now we've got to really be intentional about what we're doing and ensuring that we do have, we're not doing things because we're excited to get stuff done, that we're doing the things that we need to be doing. In addition to that, I think the compensation has been a big thing for the community, for the city, trying to get to a point where the employees are on par with their industry peers. I think we're approaching that. I think that that has produced, we've kind of seen that wash through multiple cycles. You know, we did a mid-year adjustment for the police and fire for the first time. You know, I don't know what the compensation proposal is going to look like right now. You know, we're going to have to really, I don't know, you know, it's going to be, we need to really verify what our projected expenses are, compare that to our revenue, kind of see what that lays out. So we'll have some dialogue about that. I don't know that Randy's going to be ready to present that necessarily Tuesday when he was hoping to. He and I want to spend some time together looking at that. You know, just to plant the seed, you know, we have the experience-based pay scale. So you can just go, the minimum effort is just bumping everybody up their experience year. You know, that won't reach the 3% COLA published by DLG, 3.6% COLA probably by DLG. So do you do that? And what does that look like? Or the next market study, the final market study step might be a little bit higher than the 3.6%. It might end up being about 6. So what do we do? And so there's some philosophical stuff there that we will have to dive into. That will be a deeper conversation. But overall, the city's in good condition compared to some of our neighbors that we've been working with at as we observe it at the City Manager Association meeting the other day. We're in good shape. Now, you have to manage yourself, and we have to be disciplined, and we will continue to try to instill that and do that.
Okay. Quick question. So the fund balance carry forward in the general fund, is that the same thing? It's cash plus buildings and?
yeah, and that's just how the math and the accounting works. It's the same thing. So we'll try to adjust it next time so that it is more closely aligned to dollars and not the built-in asset behind it.
Oh, well, and.
Yeah.
The
don't wanna
software
create-
will include the asset.
Yeah.
So you can't
Yeah.
just print that.
Yeah,
report.
it's a true calculated balance. So
Balance
the carry forward, we can make the manual adjustment on.
Yeah, and I don't want to create any more work. I think it's important. I asked the question because
Yeah.
this gets out, people need to understand it. We have an understanding about what it really means and what it
Yeah.
doesn't mean.
Yeah.
And you all did a great job of explaining
Yeah.
that, so. But with that said, the chair would like to entertain a motion to adjourn. Mhm. Oh, well, we could,
I move that we adjourn.
thank you, sir.
Second.
No, you can't, he goes second. Nobody wanted a second, okay. Well, thank you. All those in favor? Oh, wait. Thanks staff for presentation too. Good information. All those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, likewise, let's go home. Thank you.